I died for 3 minutes in a war nobody likes to remember. That is how I start, because if I don't say it plain and blunt, the rest of the story collapses into polite history, and I lose the shape of what I felt. I don't mean died like a line on a casualty list. I mean my world narrowed to a single thin thread, sound smeared into one long whoosh, my mouth full of diesel taste, my hands useless. Later men in white coats would say the words clinical death, and cardiac arrest, and scribble times in minutes. I remember it as 3 minutes, 3 black breaths that felt like a lifetime. And when I came back up through the dark, there was an image I could not shake. A river of fuel, lamps of factories, and the faces of men who had everything, and yet destroyed it rather than give us a drop. You will expect me to begin with a battle, with tactics and maps and heroics. That's not how it was. The war did not end with a single gunshot. It ended for me at the edge of a field where the Germans found what they thought was a miracle and learned instead how badly they had already lost. It was December 1944. The air at dawn had the hardness of iron. Cold like that does something to sound. It sharpens it, as if the world were tuned to tin. I remember the Tiger tank that day, how its engine coughed and then went dead as if choked. We climbed out of the mud and the heatless breath of the machines and saw men moving like ghosts among stacks of olive drab, jerry cans, as if someone had taken the sea and piled it on the ground. I have called the place Hansfeld, verification_needed, most of my life, because that name stuck to the scrap of paper I found in a captured file. Whether the maps say it exactly the same is for men with better eyesight and steadier hands to say. For us, the name didn't need to be precise. We called places what they felt like. A good field, a cold road, a miracle. The miracle that morning looked like rows of metal cuboids, square and ordinary, every one of them smelling faintly of gasoline and rain. We were starving for fuel. Our tanks breathed it greedily. A tiger could burn through 1,000 gallons, like a man through bread, if the road was bad and the orders urgent. You learn quickly what running dry means when you watch a crew climb out of a perfectly intact tank, because the fuel gauge reads empty. I had seen wrecked tanks before, shells blown through, but these were different. These tanks were whole, like sleeping beasts, their belts unbroken, their radios silent for want of juice. You could tell the men who had driven them were not angry at loss, but blank with disbelief. A machine, a piece of iron, is nothing. Yet when it will not move for lack of a simple liquid, it becomes the most bitter betrayal. At Hansfeld, there were drums and cans and open tanks, a captured American fuel dump. The figure that has been told in different ways, 50,000 gallons, sits in my memory like a fact of its own. Men rifled through manifests. I remember fingers blue from cold tracing lists where quantities seemed almost obscene. 50,000, one of the younger lads said, as if saying the number might make it true. We siphoned like starving animals. We laughed at first, real free laughter. Some of us cried without knowing why. A man soaked his mitts and pressed them to the face of another like a benediction. We ate our breakfast with gasoline-sweet fingers and felt for a handful of minutes that the war had been a mistake, that it had been something we could walk away from by waking up and finding our bellies full. We did not know then that what we held were not simply prizes. We did not know that those piles of fuel were the outward sign of a system the Allies had laid down across Europe. Pipelines under the sea and roads that ran with trucks like arteries. Convoys designated with nicknames like the Red Ball Express that moved day after day. We did not know how much production the enemy could draw upon, how many factories in America hummed like beehives, how the whole machine of supply could outpace our best-laid plans. I remember kneeling on frozen ground and reading a torn-back issue of a Stars and Stripes that someone had taken from a knocked-out truck. A headline spoke of pipelines laid beneath the channel, the project they called Pluto. The name was almost funny then, a child's joke about a cartoon dog, but the substance was not funny. It was like reading that a rival had invented a way to send coal down a river without spending your breath. The manifest papers we found were full of numbers and roots. They read, in the blunt arithmetic of logistics, like a map of inevitability. Those are the things historians will tell you with their diagrams and tables. The Allies had a force multiplier in production, in oil, in the capability to feed armies over long distances. In human terms, it meant that a division could be kept moving for days at a stretch, while an enemy division might sit idle, because a single tank had a dry gauge. It meant that a commander's decision could be shaped not by bravery, but by the fact that his radio had no power, or that the ambulance couldn't get to him. The front lines move not only because of courage, but because of the pipes and roads that feed them. In our little world, however, those distinctions came as a slow, bruising comprehension. After the first hours of happy looting and frantic siphoning, the mood shifted. We began to read what else was in the files. Orders to destroy rather than abandon. Notes on convoys that would make any sensible officer smile with envy. The Americans, they were burning their own depots in places we later learned, not out of spite, but strategic denial. If they could not keep it, they would rather see it blackened than in our hands. To watch a depot set alight by your enemy's engineers is to see triumph and defeat mixed in an ugly cocktail. The flames swallowed quantities I could hardly imagine. The black smoke rose like a column of accusation. We stood then at the edge of Stavelot. Verification _ needed. That is the name that keeps finding me in the archives and in my head, and watched. I can still see the line of men on the far ridge holding torches like a grim, impossible ritual. They were Americans, yes, because they were wearing our colors in the sort of way that is unmistakable once you have looked for it with stress in your chest. They were setting fire to fuel rather than lose it to us. Some of my fellows swore, others went quiet. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt like a physical pain, that these men were burning what could have kept a dozen of our boys alive and well and moving. They were setting alight the very thing that would have let us drive on at speed, and they did it with a calmness that looked, to us then, like both cruelty and a kind of desperate wisdom. It would be a mistake to think any of those men woke up that morning excited to burn their own stuff. Destruction is always a hard, dark business. But the calculus of modern war is cruel and precise. If you cannot protect a store of fuel, you deny it to the enemy. That doctrine, when practiced on a European field in winter, had consequences that reached into the most human pocket. Stretchers left unused because the trucks to move them had no gas. Wounded men kept in rows because ambulances could not run. Prisoners left by the roadside because you could not spare the fuel to take them anywhere. It is here that the ethical knot tightens. We learned, too, the names of the systems that sustained the other side. The Red Ball Express was not poetry. It was the grind of thousands of trucks, drivers young and old, driving hour after hour to keep the front alive. Pluto pipeline under the ocean was a technical wonder that meant fuel could be pushed through steel under the channel rather than risk the vulnerability of convoys. These words began to sound less like jargon and more like witches' spells that turned industry into power. To explain it plainly, imagine a river of gasoline. Imagine that river could be diverted whenever and wherever the commanders wished. That is what it felt like when you realized the enemy was not scraping by. They had reserves so abundant that they could afford the luxury of burning. A few men in our unit had the habit of making immediate moral arguments, as if conviction could be spun faster than the trucks. They waste it, one said, slapping his boot against a jerry can as if that proved anything. They throw it away and teach us nothing but hunger. Another, an older corporal who had been before the front farther south, looked at the sheets and fumbled with a cigarette and said nothing. Experience, it turns out, makes you careful with words that demand a neat moral shape. The world of supply is messy. It is seldom romance and often a ledger. I was young, stubborn, and full of a soldier's sense that things were black or white. The sight of the burning depot bruised that simplicity fast. There is a detail I cannot keep from telling, the way the German soldiers reacted when they saw abundance. We had been taught to think of the enemy as a faceless mass, as a machine bearing down. But in the moments when fuel glinted in sunlight and rows of cans lined the field, you saw men stop like people at a window, watching something they did not want to admit. You could read not hatred across their faces, but a fatigue so deep it looked almost like shame. There was bitterness, yes, the taste of being outmatched, but there was also a human confusion. Many of them had families, homes, and hunger. Seeing waste, to use that clumsy word, made a moral echo in them. It did not make the war right. It made it real in a new way. We took what we could from Hansfeld, and then left to rejoin our leaving column. In the chaos that followed, we encountered scenes that would later press on my chest and make it hard to breathe. Vehicles abandoned, not because they were shot, but because their tanks were empty. Anti-aircraft guns parked like dead beetles beside a road because the tractor that would pull them had no juice. There were crews sitting on the ground with heads in hands, staring at their tools like men at funerals. For them, the material reality of war, the metal, the fuel, the spare parts, was the measure of their hope. I should be clear. Material facts are not a moral defense. The fact that one side could make more fuel does not make all their actions righteous. There were massacres and atrocities that we later learned of. Momedy, verification_needed, sits in the records as a stain that cannot be excused by supply lines, and seeing the barrels and the smoke does not lessen those crimes. If anything, it deepens the discomfort. When scarcity gnaws at logic and humanity frays, people do ugly things. I would later try to read the chain that led men to such acts, and find that at times the single most common ingredient was not ideology alone, but the raw cornered hunger of logistic failure. This is not explanation. It is a sober attempt to understand. I remember, too, how quickly the practical details swallowed our simple emotions. The raw euphoria of capture was followed by the mechanical problem. How to move it, how to distribute it, how to hide it. Siphoning takes time. Filling canteens and tanks takes time. If you do not have the transport, you cannot carry even what you have. We had a handful of trucks. The Allies had whole columns. The contrast is not mere numbers. It is the difference between a living force and the illusion of one. Sometime in those first hours I found a paper that had been tucked into a file, the sort of administrative note armies produce by the thousand. It listed shipments, ports of entry, and route numbers. For men like me, who had been trained to think with maps and orders, it read like a new kind of map, one that showed not where men stood, but where movement came from. To see the supply chain on paper is to see power in ink, steel mills, refineries, tankers bringing fuel, trucks running day and night. I remember a line about red ball routes and a count of truck tonnages that made me dizzy. It felt like the enemy had multiplied the wheels of war 100-fold. In my head, I translated it into simple terms. More trucks equals more movement. More movement equals more options. More options mean the ability to choose where to strike and when to run. That was the slow, grinding, humiliating discovery. The war we had been fighting was not just fought on hills and villages, but on assembly lines and at refineries. The man with a perfect plan on paper could find all his work undone when a furnace in Detroit coughed. The heroics we read about in dispatches, tank duels, bayonet charges, last stands, are dramatic, I will not deny. But they are the glitter on a process whose foundation is monotonous and industrial. The factories make the bullets. The logistics make the battlefield possible. For me, this realization was not academic. It narrowed and changed the shape of my anger. I had been full of a young man's straightforward righteousness. Seeing piles of jerry cans and then watching them vanish in a pyre made me feel both cheated and ashamed. Cheated because it was so obvious and so cruelly efficient. Ashamed because I had secretly loved the romantic idea of a soldier's fight being decisive in itself. To watch the machinery of supply turn victory into an inevitable outcome, and to feel myself a small part of its failure, is an experience that stays with a man. We moved on from Hansfeld with pockets fuller and heads heavier. The column wound through woods and along roads that had been churned into glistening mud. Traffic had slowed to a crawl in many places, not from enemy action, but from gridlock. Trucks piled up because bridges were congested, because units had broken in two and couldn't find their way past one another without the presence of fuel to move them. It is one of those things people outside of war rarely consider, the way a road can become a trap. Imagine a convoy broken like a clogged artery. No blood flows and everything downstream goes dead. The next significant thing we saw was the fire at Stavelet. It is a sight that lodges in memory with a photographic stubbornness. They had lit it deliberately. The flames were not from a raid or a shell, but from deliberate engineering. I am careful in how I say these things because names in the documents are sometimes garbled, and what I recall from a soldier's memory is not the same as an archive's accounting. Still, for us the image was simple. A town turned into a furnace, stacks of fuel erupting in tongues of flame, the air thick with black smoke that folded the sky into a blanket. Men walked away from it stunned, as if from a funeral pyre that had taken not only what it burned, but the idea of victory itself. As we stood there, the cold and the fire pressed together, steam rising where snow met flame, a sort of world made of contradiction. Some of my men cursed the Americans with a bitterness that tasted thin and small. Some wept, which looked to me then like mercy. It would be easy to tell you that acts like that hardened me against the enemy. The truth is more complicated. It hurt, and it opened a crack in my certainty. It made me realize that wars are not only fought by soldiers, but by factories and river ports and men in offices who decide whether to run a pipeline or a convoy. And in that realization, pride and myth lost weight. It is often said now that modern war is decided by logistics. I did not know that phrase then. I would later hear historians say it in comfortable chairs. But when I first stood in the glare of a burning depot, my understanding was not a neat sentence, but a jagged set of images and feelings. Metal cans, a column of smoke, men whose faces had gone soft from fatigue, a town whose church tower watched a sky full of black. I felt smaller than the myths I'd been fed, and more real than the propaganda. I had seen the backstage of war, and found it less noble than I had been taught. There are other things I could tell you from that winter day, small acts that stay with you because they were human and therefore hard to fit into the tidy boxes of history. A sergeant who shared his last cigarette with a captured driver. A soldier who gave away a bread ration to a boy who had been following us for days. An officer who burned the identity papers of prisoners rather than have them used as bargaining chips. These small conversations of mercy and petty cruelty are the stitches that hold the larger fabric together. They do not alter the fact that industry did most of the work that season, but they remind you that people remained people in the middle of the engine. We left the burning fields and moved on, the convoy groaning and creaking as men tried to get their vehicles started. We learned to be careful with triumph. We moved with new superstition. Never linger too long at a prize. Do not celebrate until you have counted the cost in fuel and transport. That prudence was more than caution. It was an education in the arithmetic of survival. The idea that war could be won by a single brave act was being replaced in my head by the knowledge that it could be lost by small, cumulative failures, a missed delivery, a blown pipeline, an exhausted truck driver falling asleep at the wheel. And there was always, at the back of my thoughts, a darker knowledge. Scarcity makes monsters of ordinary men. Atrocities do not always spring from ideology alone. They sometimes bloom where transport and medicine cannot reach the wounded, where orders break down and fear takes over. You cannot explain away crimes by saying, "They were hungry," but you can say the hunger was a part of the story. Later I learned the names of specific massacres, and will not repeat them here without care. Some of those events are recorded, some remain fragmented in old reports, but the presence of those shadows affected us even then. When you stand beside piles of burnt petrol and watch men carry corpses without the means to bury or transport them, the moral arithmetic gets complicated in the coldest of ways. The column kept moving. Roads would open and close like a mouth. Sometimes you could make miles in an hour, and sometimes you were stopped for days. We found abandoned equipment that had been perfect in its engineering, but useless without fuel. We saw a tank with paint still bright, a machine that had not met enemy fire, but had simply been left to rust like an argument without proof. Those empty tanks became to me a small gallery of failure, monuments to how modern war reduces valor to logistics. It is in these stretches that I come back to that 3-minute darkness. The moment came later, but the seeds were sown in the hours after Hansfeld and the night by the burning depot. I will tell you about the blackout and what I thought I saw, and I will not claim that what I saw was a vision from elsewhere. I will only tell you that, in the absence of breath and the narrowing of senses, my mind put together images and ideas that later arranged themselves into a thesis. The war was being decided not just at gunpoint, but at the factory door and the end of a fuel line. That conclusion did not make me wiser overnight. It made me uneasy and made me want to ask questions I had not been trained to ask as a boy with a rifle. When you are a soldier, you learn to count what matters in practical terms. Shells, ammunition, spare parts, food, fuel, these are the real currencies. Glory and honor sit on top of that like a ribbon on a crate. In the weeks after Hansfeld, every decision, every casualty, every frozen face seemed to revolve back to those crates. Some men accepted it with a stoic shrug. Others became bitter and churlish. I suppose I did a bit of both. I kept thinking of the stacks of jerry cans and of the men who had lit their own supplies on fire because they could not defend them. I kept thinking of the faces of our wounded waiting for ambulances that could not come. And I kept thinking of a thin, ugly whisper. What does it mean when the winner can afford to burn his own treasures? At that point in the campaign, there was still the expectation of action, not endless retreat, not surrender, just the short, sharp business of movement and counter-movement. But the shape of that movement was beginning to reveal itself as I had never expected. Not a chess game played by brave knights, but a long haul run by well-oiled machines. If a side could outproduce the other at scale, it could choose when to make the decisive shove. We pressed on. The next day the road was a serried mess of tracks, men bent over the engines and swearing, officers flipping maps and counting. Our convoy inched forward past a line of soldiers who had just come through a field and carried with them news that made the air colder. More depots burned, more empty tanks. It was in that crawl that my heart failed me. Later, everyone would give a clinical explanation, and I would not argue with the doctors. But in the second before the darkness, in the light that seems to stick between what was and what will be, I had an image of miles of conveyor belts and smokestacks and the faces of workers far from, the front making something that would decide my fate. It was not a prophecy. It was a memory being formed in the only way my brain knew in failing light, by stringing together the things I had seen and feared. When my eyes opened again, and the world reasserted its noises, the convoy was still there, but something in me had changed. I felt, not like a new man, but like an older one who had had an unwanted lesson. I had a clarity that sharpened into conviction over the next days. Modern war will not be won by single acts of heroism alone. Industry and supply are the secret generals. I could trace in my mind the map of fuel lines and truck routes, and see how the theater of war looked less like a battlefield and more like an enormous, slow machine. We moved then toward La-Glai's verification underscore needed, and towns I had only heard of by reputation. The countryside was a patchwork of farms and ruined hedges. Signposts leaned like drooped flags. Along the roads we passed a tank that would later be displayed in a museum, a dull, hollow silhouette that now serves as some people's proof and others remind her of failure. For me, in that winter of loss and cold and smoke, it was a symbol. The empty gauge inside the tank a simple, unadorned statement about what decides whether a machine and the men inside it live or die. That is where we will stop for now. At the ridge above a town we were told had been stripped and stubbornly defended. The smell of black smoke still in my nostrils, and the taste of diesel like a constant bitter note on my tongue. There was more to come, roads that jammed, men who argued and fought not only the enemy but exhaustion, and events that would force me to weigh past certainties against the harsh arithmetic of supply. I did not yet know how the 3 minutes of nothingness would rearrange my life, only that when the darkness lifted, I had a new question I could not unask. If war could be bought and shipped across an ocean, how many men would have to be starved of it before the course of history changed? We crested that ridge near La-Glai's. Verification underscore needed, with the wind slicing at our faces and the smoke of the burned depots in our lungs. And everything that had been confused the last few days slid into a shape that stayed with me. I have tried over the years to tell what happened in neat sentences. The truth is angular and full of small corners. There was a tank beside the road, an enemy vehicle, its paint dulled, its turret like a mute head turned to the sky. It sat as if someone had taken a living thing and sewn its mouth shut, whole, intact, and useless. I remember the bitterness in the men who stood around it, how quickly language narrowed to one thin complaint. Empty. That single word carried the story of the campaign. We carried on. The countryside soured into ruins and a strange provisional peace, where every scrape of metal and every footstep sounded like a decision. I slept little, and when I did, my dreams were not of shooting but of motion. Trucks spilling over roads, refineries belching light, men in factories at machines they never saw, and convoys that never stopped. In the waking hours, we argued about blame and meaning, and what it was that had made the difference between those who kept moving and those who did not. The arguments never resolved. They had to do with luck, with leadership, with courage, and they had to do with steel, asphalt, and oil. If you want to see some of the papers and maps that began this change in me, they're in the links below. There are manifest pages that look at first like dry lists, but read, once you know how, like a catalog of destiny. Subscribe if you want the notes and photographs I've kept. There is more in them than a single man's memory can carry. That is the only soft ask I will make here. After the march into the villages and the passing of empty tanks, it became clearer that the war's muscles were not only soldiers, but the factories and docks that fed them. When you read the manifests and follow the routes on a map, you begin to see the theater as an organism. Supply does not whisper, it roars. It needs a spine of roads and arteries of fuel and lungs of manpower at refineries and warehouses. And where those systems were intact, the forces they fed were not easily stopped. I was not alone in noticing. Within days, the talk among commanders shifted from the audacity of maneuvers to the courage of logistics. Men who had never learned the arithmetic of tonnage found themselves thinking in tons per mile. I remember an officer of ours, a practical man, blunt as a rule, showing teeth when he compared an American convoy to a whole regiment of soldiers. They don't have to be brave, he said, meaning no insult at the men themselves. They have to be steady. You could not argue with the observation. Steadiness, repetition, and infuriating, boring competence. 1,000 drivers turning up every dawn, won the day more often than the audacity of a single night raid. There were other, grimmer lessons. Mobility is not only about attack, it is about mercy. We learned, over and over, that petrol was the difference between a stretchered man seeing hospital light and being left on the snow. I saw a medic sit, his hands empty, because the ambulance that should have taken the wounded had no fuel. He sat like a man who had been given a riddle he could not answer, and waited for the world to provide the missing piece. Those images, the little unheroic corners, haunt me perhaps more than the larger ones. The dead are the loud part of the ledger. The neglected are the small, constant sum. The winter tightened its grip. Roads became ice rinks and mud choked where snow melted. Trucks slid off ditches and lay like overturned beetles. Fuel that might once have been home in a depot had to be guarded and moved and rerouted. Sometimes we found caches with papers that explained a little of how the other side managed its flows. Names like Pluto and the Red Ball Express began to sound less like acronyms and more like the true commanders of the war. Anonymous, persistent, unromantic. A pipeline under the sea and 100 trucks running night after night do not make good tailies at the mess tent, but they make an army move. There is a point where the practical observation turns into an ethical one, some sort of moral knot you cannot untie. Seeing waste, the deliberate burning of your enemy's stores, makes you ask hard questions about the nature of victory. If a people can afford to burn what keeps men alive, what does that say about the calculation behind it? The calculus is cold. Deny the enemy supply, and you gain an operational advantage. But the human ledger keeps other entries. I remember a soldier in our group picking up a child's toy among rubble and weeping without pretending to understand why. The war had become a series of choices in which the balance often fell on metal, not on men. I will speak plainly about what we heard and what we witnessed, and then step back from any attempt to explain it away. There were atrocities, events so raw and morally grievous that I have learned to treat their mention with care. Reports of mass killings circulated. Names like Momedy, verification _needed, came up in hushed conversations and in the papers we traded. No accounting of supply and demand makes those crimes less real, nor do they excuse them. They are a dark thread, separate yet running through the same tapestry. Scarcity can sharpen cruelty. Abundance can mask it. Both conditions allow for human choices that cannot be undone by arithmetic. In the weeks after the forests and fields, there was a lull of sorts. Not peace, but a recalibration. Enemy units that had seemed invincible were parked upriver, and once proud crews sat with hands in their laps because pumps were empty and nobody could patch them. The shape of a campaign can be altered by a single refinery going quiet several thousand miles away. You learn to be small with wonder after that, to avoid exaggerated triumph, and to treat surprise with caution. My 3-minute darkness came in one of those moments of banal exhaustion. We had pushed through a ruined village, and had paused to catch our breath beside a brook that had turned black from runoff. I was leaning against an overturned gas can. Absurd, to find the very thing you needed, and yet feel no solace in it, when everything narrowed. My vision went gray and soft, sounds attenuated to the hum of distant engines. There is no language that comfortably describes the border between life and the thin, cold absence that edges death. For me, it had no halos or ethereal music. It had images, concrete and plain, of factories and warehouses, and men working on drills far away. In that narrowing my mind flung together all it had been taking in, the smell of diesel, the manifest pages, the convoys on the maps. It was not a prophecy. It was the synthesis of a terrified, tired intelligence. When I came back, the world returned with a brightness that felt painful and revealing all at once. I do not suppose that makes me special. Soldiers have small miracles of survival, and call them what they will. My point in telling you is not to claim spectacle, but to explain why, after that lightless moment, everything else acquired a new meaning for me. The personal moment sharpened a historical one. Whereas before I had thought of war in terms of valor and honor and the individual moment, afterwards I could not unsee how much the grand outcome depended on the humdrum competence of supply. After the fighting tapered, and the front lines shifted with the imperceptible finality of an exhausted animal, I tried to make sense of my own place in a world that had been remade by horsepower and pipelines. There were visits to camps and then home, or to transit stations that processed men on their way back. I will not give you the dates, nor will I pretend the paperwork of demobilization was heroic. It was administrative, sometimes cruel in its slowness, and often oddly humane in small, surprising ways. A Red Cross parcel, a sympathetic clerk, a letter from a mother who had kept faith. You return to things that have not remained the same. Decades passed. I married, had children, and tried to let ordinary life be a kind of therapy for memory. Yet every so often something would pull me back. A photograph, an old manifest slipped into a drawer, a newsreel of a museum unveiling. In the 1970s, I found myself standing in a hall, smelling of wax and varnish, facing an engine the size of a house. It was a tank that had once been a terror, now made into an exhibit. I touched its metal, and my fingers found a place where the paint had worn thin. Inside the turret a gauge had been preserved for display, the needle frozen at empty. You could have taken that vehicle as proof of many things, depending on whose side of history you stood. For me it was simply a blunt, unavoidable object lesson. Inside that steel box, men had been close to life and death in a way numbers could not quite show. Museums change memory. They concentrate it and sometimes domesticate it. Yet when I sit before that tank's stalled gauge, I feel the old moral ache as keenly as ever. Young people come with cameras and smartphones and ask me questions, direct and blunt. They want to know which battles mattered, which commanders were cunning, what single deed turned the tide. I tell them what I know. No single battle, no solitary genius, but 100,000 small things. Trucks that turned up on time, a pipeline that did not leak, a factory that kept to its shifts through air raid warnings. They look surprised and a little disappointed because history wants a headline and not a ledger. I tell them also about the small faces, the medic who had nothing to carry the wounded, the child with soot on his cheeks, the man who sobbed when the depot burned. They ask about heroes and villains, and I tell them to look at the ledger. This is not a neat moral. It does not absolve wrongdoing, nor does it provide comfort. What it does is demand a certain humility in how we tell the story of modern war. If your enemy can spin horsepower into mobility faster than you can, you have to find ways to match that. If you cannot, your bravery is met by indifferent mechanics, and your best plans are made brittle by shortages. That fact has political implications and moral ones, and both are too big to be settled by the recollection of a single old man. Still, the recollection matters because it comes with a kind of witness. I saw the piles of cans, the columns of smoke, the abandoned tanks, the men who had to decide whether to burn their own supplies. I saw the maps that read like destinies. There are letters in my box at home from men on the other side of the line. In the autumn of my life, I have exchanged, through the careful work of veterans groups and museums, notes with survivors who once wore a different uniform. Their gratitude is not for glory, but for being seen. We too were hungry, one wrote, but we were also people. Those letters have been hard medicine. Humanizing the enemy does not let them off the moral hook for crimes they committed. It complicates the narrative in ways that are difficult to simplify into a lecture or a film. I have been asked, sometimes sharply, whether seeing the supply side of war made me less sympathetic to the suffering we endured. The blunt answer is, no. It broadened my sorrow. Recognizing that numbers shaped outcomes did not make the individual suffering less real. If anything, it made it more unbearable. To know that a truck that did not come could mean a man slow. Freezing in a ditch is to face a kind of arithmetic that is both technical and tragic. In the museum, years later, two things struck me. First, the emptiness of mechanical things. A tank in perfect condition, stopped by absence rather than shot to pieces. Second, the persistence of human memory. A small plaque next to that machine, naming regiments and dates, but never quite capturing the smell or the cold or the taste of diesel that lodged in a man's mouth. People like tidy labels. History resists them. The empty gauge, the wooden jerry cans on display, the photographs of convoys. These are anchors, but they cannot fully carry the weight of what was lost. I do not presume to tell younger men and women how to respond to the past. I will say this. Remember the arithmetic. Do not let romantic narratives of the lone hero blind you to the fact that most modern victories require a quiet, grinding competence that is ultimately social and industrial. It is not a glamorous lesson, but it matters. It matters for how we plan, how we vote, how we think about what it takes to avoid needless suffering. My own moral reckoning after the war took many forms. There were nights when I could not sleep for the images of burning depots. There were times I resented the men who had the luxury to destroy because they could afford it. There were also days when I learned to see such acts as bitter strategic choices in a cruel arithmetic. I do not forgive crimes because I understand the context. I try instead to hold two truths at once, that scarcity and logistics influence behavior, and that individual men remain responsible for choices even under pressure. That tension, the historian's neatness and the soldier's messy heart, is what I carry. Sometimes I visit the regimental graves and kneel for a moment. Names on stone are not arguments, they are reminders. I think of the small economies of war, trucks that arrived, rifles that jammed from mud, a fuel line repaired just in time. I have met engineers whose hands were scarred from welding in factories far from any front line, and their humility is striking. We made the parts, one said simply, and they used them. It is an unadorned sentence, but it captures a truth that we ought not to forget. Wars are as much built as they are fought. You will ask, perhaps, what the point of all this is. If I say it bluntly, do not glorify battle as if bravery alone decides nations. Pay attention to the mundane. Roads, refineries, the people who keep the clocks running. Those mundane things have outsized moral consequences. And when you remember the past, try to include the small human acts, mercy in the midst of brutality, a shared cigarette between enemies, a bread ration given to a child. Those are the things that balance the ledger in ways numbers cannot. I do not know what to say about forgiveness beyond what my conscience has taught me. We must name crimes and hold people accountable, but we must also remember that most participants were human beings caught in systems larger than themselves. That is not an excuse. It is an observation that should make us more careful in the future. If modern conflict is organized around supply chains and industrial capacity, then decisions about those systems are moral decisions in their own right. A society that invests in the ability to keep men mobilized must ask itself what price it is willing to pay and whom it will protect. At the end of my days, I visit the tanks, sometimes in a small museum or in a photo album. The empty needle, the jerry cans lined like sentries, the manifest pages with their cold numerals, they all come back to me. I try to tell the young men and women who listen not to see the past as a parade of heroes and villains, but as a web of choices. Read the maps. Look at the logistics. And when you do not allow the human faces to be washed out by the numbers. If this story has moved you, there are sources and photographs that accompany what I've told. You'll find links below to archives and museum exhibits where you can see the tanks and the manifests and, if you are willing to go, the human documents that refuse to let the past be tidy. Go look. The truth is larger and stranger than any single man can tell. Before I go, one last thing. I sometimes meet men who ask whether, had we known then what we know now about logistics, the war would have ended differently. History is a stubborn classroom. It does not allow counterfactuals as a comfort. But I will tell you what I believe. To think strategically is to care for the small things as fiercely as the grand gestures. Protecting supply lines, tending to the medicine and transport, preserving the quiet competence of an economy, those are not merely technical matters. They are decisions that shape life. So remember the empty gauge and the piles of cans, and the men who had to decide whether to burn what might have saved a life. Remember also the faces of those who did what they could and those who did harm. Hold both things, the ledger and the human story. That is the kind of memory worth passing on. If you want to dig deeper into the documents and the maps that stayed with me, you'll find links below to museums and archives that keep the records. Visit them. Look close. And when you stand before an empty fuel gauge in a tank case, let it be not a curiosity, but a question. What are we willing to build, and at what cost? I am old now. The taste of diesel has faded from my mouth, though the memory of it never does. I tell you this because I want the memory of those winter days, the cold, the smoke, the empty tanks, and the moral unease to be more than a footnote in some textbook. It was, for me, the moment an entire war seemed to be decided not by singular valor, but by the patient, grinding work of keeping men and machines supplied. If that is a less exciting story than the one the poets tell, perhaps it is the more necessary one.